Hey guys, tonight we step softly through ancient shadows into a world painted in candlelight and petals, where the hum of a distant fountain blends with the rustle of silk robes brushing over marble. You stand in the heart of an Ottoman garden, just as the sun slips away. Lanterns flicker into life, their light catching the deep reds, buttery golds, and moody purples of tulips nodding gently in the evening breeze. No crowds, no chaos, just the sound of sandals on polished stone, and the barely there scent of something sweet, earthy, and vaguely spicy. But don't be fooled by the calm. This isn't your average flower show. This is politics. This is poetry. This is obsession. These tulips, they're more than decorative, they're status. They're coded messages, and if you pluck the wrong one in front of the wrong person, well, you probably won't survive this garden party. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're settling in from somewhere cozy tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Always love seeing where we all drift off together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your walk in the famed Gulhane Park, though back in the early 1700s, it's not quite so public. Then, it's the private garden of the Topkapi Palace, the imperial residence of the Ottoman sultans. Guards patrol discreetly, looking mostly bored. You pass under an arched trellis, the wood cool to the touch, covered in vines that haven't flowered yet, but the tulips they're everywhere, and they're not just here because someone thought they were pretty. No. These tulips are curated, selected, arranged with the meticulousness of military formations. Some are tall and dagger-shaped, others curved like calligraphy, others still blunt, almost spherical. You crouch beside a shallow reflecting pool. Tulips frame its edges like painted sentries. Water trickles, breaking the silence every few seconds. Above, the stars begin to flicker. Somewhere nearby, a court poet recites a verse that goes something like, "The tulip bows, not in shame, but in elegance. The emperor of petals, in a republic of green." Ottoman tulip culture was rich in metaphor. The flower stood for prosperity, perfection, divine order. Even its name Lali in Ottoman Turkish shares letters with Allah when written in Arabic script, though not in meaning. Still, that didn't stop devout courtiers from waxing poetic about the spiritual grace of tulips. Historians still argue whether this association was deeply religious, or just a bit of floral numerology gone viral. But either way, it stuck. And from the 16th century onwards, the tulip bloomed, not only in soil, but in the imagination of the empire. Now, picture this. A sultan strolling through this very garden by lamplight. Behind him, advisors trail like shadows, noting which bulbs he lingers near. Did he stop at the deep indigo? The one with the white streak, like a crescent moon? That might mean a new vizier is due for promotion, or exile, and if you're thinking, that's a lot to read into a flower, you'd be right. But welcome to Ottoman court culture where everything meant something, and nothing was just decoration. Even the night air seems carefully arranged. The fragrance is balanced, not too sweet, not too heavy. A servant passes silently, scattering crushed cardamom along the garden path to sweeten the steps of nobles who'll arrive shortly. In the distance, you hear soft music, perhaps a ney. Flute. Breathy and fragile, as if the air itself is shy. You pass a stone bench, where a grand vizier once took tea with a foreign ambassador, discussing trade routes, while a tulip nodded politely between them. Listening to the negotiations, the flower beds, arranged in radial symmetry, mimic the order the Ottomans sought in the universe. Circle within circle, a flower inside a frame of hedges, each carefully trimmed. Nothing is accidental. Even the shadows fall as if trained. But there's one odd little patch off to the side, half forgotten. A tulip growing wild, its petals slightly uneven, probably a mistake. Probably, you'd think someone would pluck it. But no, that's not how it works, not here. In this world, even a misshapen flower might be protected by metaphor. It could stand for rebellion, or natural beauty, or divine unpredictability. Better not risk it. You lean back on the bench, listening. From a nearby gallery, two scholars debate softly over which breed of tulip was planted by Sultan Ahmed III himself. One insists it was the feathered flame, a tulip so rare its petals split like a phoenix tail. The other swears it was the knight's whisker, dark as spilled ink and just as permanent. Neither can agree, but both nod solemnly, as if to say, either way, the Sultan had taste. And here's a quirky little truth. Ottoman tax records from the 1600s list tulip bulbs as taxable items. That's right. You could own land, livestock, and also tulips. And if your bulb collection got too extravagant, someone from the palace might start asking questions. The tulip, you see, was also surveillance. A quiet way to track who was rising too quickly, whose garden bloomed too richly. You stand now in the middle of a stone path, flanked by hundreds of flickering lanterns and silent petals. Every flower has a name, a lineage, a whisper, and the night has only just begun. You turn from the neat rows of lantern-lit flower beds and follow a gently winding path that dips toward a quieter courtyard. Here, the tulips give way to older plants, wild violets, shy roses, and a few scraggly cypresses that creak softly in the breeze, and then you stop because you see it. A single low bed of tulips, not arranged, not curated, just growing. Scruffy, unpredictable, and gently swaying like they belong to no empire at all. This, my friend, is what we might call the origin story, because believe it or not, tulips didn't begin their lives in Ottoman palaces or European paintings. They started in the wild, stony slopes of the Pamir Mountains, yes. That massive knot of peaks stretching across Central Asia. Think modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and bits of Western China. There, the tulip was just another tough little flower, surviving cold winters, scorching summers, and the occasional wandering goat. But somewhere, centuries before the Ottomans turned it into botanical royalty, nomads from Turkic tribes took notice. Tulips weren't soft. They weren't fragile. They bloomed fast and bright, then disappeared, almost defiantly. Like poetry, with a deadline, these nomad tribes, like the Agus and the Seljuks, began folding tulips into their oral traditions. Carpets wove them into their borders. Cavalrymen tucked them into saddle pouches for good luck. And eventually, tulip bulbs began traveling. Quietly, steadily, inside saddlebags and clay pots. A kind of root-level diplomacy by the 11th century. The Seljuks, ancestors of the Ottomans, were planting tulips across Persia and Anatolia. Still wild, still mostly symbolic, but slowly becoming something more. Now, here's the thing, historians still argue whether these early flowers were actually Tulipa, suavialenza, close ancestor of the modern tulipor. Whether we're back-projecting our obsession onto similar-looking blooms. The records are sparse. Descriptions are poetic at best. But what's clear is that long before Amsterdam ever got wind of them, tulips were blooming under crescent moons and minarets. They appeared in poetry first, then architecture, then fabric. By the time the Ottomans rose in the late 13th century, the tulip was already a cultural whisper, a familiar face. But under Ottoman hands, it would become a national anthem. Fast forward to the early days of the empire. The Ottomans expand fast through Anatolia, into the Balkans, eventually right up to the gates of Vienna. But as their Borders grow outward, their taste for subtlety grows inward. And tulips, with their elegant brevity, become more than flowers. They become reflections of empire. Not just because they're beautiful, though yes they are, but because they represent something the Ottomans deeply valued: controlled beauty, short-lived elegance, and quiet power. Like the empire itself, a tulip must be cultivated with care. Too much sun, it wilts. Too little, it sulks. Wrong soil, it refuses to bloom, no matter how expensive the bulb. You continue walking. The informal courtyard transitions back into manicured walkways. The air here smells of damp soil and faint spicy saffron maybe, or something pretending to be saffron. A young gardener, no older than 15, is crouched over a cluster of bulbs. He looks up as you pass, but says nothing, just nods, and you get the feeling. This knowledge has been passed down silently, from gardener to gardener, poet to poet, court to commoner. There's no shouting in tulip culture, no grand declarations, just careful tending, and watching, and waiting for the bloom. Quirky detail time. By the 1500s, some Ottoman tulip breeders were so obsessed with cultivating new varieties that they gave their flowers names you'd swear came from a 17th century Instagram filter. Names like Light of Paradise, Matchless Pearl, Whisper of the Dawn, Those Who Hear the Scent, which, let's be honest, sounds like a perfume commercial waiting to happen. And these weren't just idle names. These were titles, identities, social markers. A wealthy patron might only display tulips that matched their personal aesthetic: deep purple for wisdom, sharp yellow for energy, ivory petals if you wanted to project humility with undertones of wealth. Naturally, you round a corner. The path curves past a stone bench, dusted with fallen petals. The garden is quiet now, like it's holding its breath. And somewhere in the stillness, the story of the tulip waits to be picked up again. Because these petals aren't done blooming. Not even close. You pause beneath a narrow arch, where a pair of low-hanging lanterns sway gently, casting golden shadows across a tile mosaic. It's quiet here, just the faint burble of a distant fountain and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot as you walk on. Something odd begins to dawn on you. Why tulips? Why not roses, or jasmine, or those impossibly fragrant damask violets the palace wives loved to hide in their sleeves? What made this flower short-lived, stingy with its bloom, sometimes cranky in cultivation, so utterly irresistible to the Ottoman soul? The answer, like most imperial secrets, hides in layers. The Ottomans didn't just love tulips. They projected themselves into tulips, to a sultan. The tulip wasn't just beautiful, it was ordered, precise, regal, that shape tall, symmetrical, tapering to a perfect point, mirrored the ideal Ottoman hierarchy. One strong center, surrounded by petals of devotion, it stood tall, but didn't spread. It bloomed in spring briefly, dramatically, then disappeared before overexposure ruined the magic. In other words, the tulip had what we might call main character energy, and this symbolism wasn't just metaphorical, it showed up everywhere. Step into a sultan's divan room, and you'll see tulips, embroidered into every cushion and curtain. Flip through official edicts, tulips etched into the margins. Even mosque domes began to feature stylized tulip calligraphy, subtly replacing the older Vinandros motifs of Persian tradition. The message was clear. The tulip was not just a flower, it was a flag. Now, historians still argue whether this widespread tulip imagery was a top-down aesthetic order from the Sultanate, or simply an organic cultural drift, but either way, by the 16th century, tulips were practically a state symbol, and one sultan in particular took this to operatic levels. His name? Sultan Ahmad III. You may not recognize him, but you've definitely felt his influences, especially if you've ever seen a hand-painted tile. In deep cobalt blue, with a single tulip arching upward like a minaret dot, Ahmed was obsessed. Not just with tulips but with beauty, symmetry, and a certain performative elegance. He ruled during what historians now call the tulip era, a dreamy, flamboyant period in the early 1700s when the empire leaned heavily into aesthetics, peace treaties, and garden parties. Ahmed oversaw the construction of grand pavilions, expanded palace gardens, and sponsored tulip breeding like it was a royal blood sport. He held seasonal tulip festivals, where guests would arrive in specially dyed silk robes to match the flower arrangements. The court poet would compose verses for individual bulbs. Yes, individual ones. Like this one's so beautiful, I forgot about taxes for a second. Artisans crafted tiny glass flutes shaped like tulip petals to serve fruit syrups. Fireworks were launched from tulip-shaped platforms. Lanterns floated on ponds like glowing flowerheads, and you, drifting through these memories now, can almost hear the faint echo of music, laughter, and the pop of distant fireworks over the BOS far. RUS. Now let's talk power for a moment. Because this wasn't all just harmless flower talk. Tulips were used as a subtle form of court messaging. If a vizier received a gift of rare bulbs from the sultan, it wasn't just botanical kindness, it was political favor, and often a reminder of loyalty. On the flip side, if a formerly floral-loving bureaucrat found himself tulipless during the spring bloom, well, maybe it was time to update his will. There's even an apocryphal tale, never quite verified, but delightful nonetheless, about a rival courtier who sabotaged another's tulip bed before a royal inspection, painting imperfections onto petals to make them look diseased. Tulip drama. Ottoman edition. And if you're wondering how people kept track of all these subtle signals, the answer is, they really cared. There were unofficial tulip rankings, bulb registries, hand-illustrated tulip catalogues shared between nobles. Think 18th century Pinterest boards, but with a lot more poetry and political consequences. You make your way down another path, now. This one edged with short walls carved in calligraphic spirals. A soft breeze stirs the tulip heads, which nod gently like sleepy diplomats. The air smells faintly of rosewater, and distant charcoal, perhaps from a brazier, warming the night tea. You pause before a shallow fountain, where tiny copper tulip spouts send thin arcs of water into a marble basin. One spout dribbles slightly offset. Charming, really. And while it would be easy to dismiss this entire flower frenzy as indulgent, the truth is it was also strategic. In a time when Europe was slowly pulling ahead with industrial innovation, the Ottomans leaned into visual diplomacy. Their gardens, their architecture, their floral obsession, it all said, "We don't need your coal, we have beauty." Whether that strategy worked, well, that's a question for later. For now, you crouch beside the fountain, dip your fingers into the cool water, and watch the ripples drift outward like so many tulips unfolding in silence. A soft chime echoes from deeper within the garden, carried on the breeze like a whisper you're not meant to hear. It isn't urgent, nothing in this world is, but it does suggest movement. You follow the sound, and soon you arrive at a wide courtyard where pale stone tiles glow like moonlight under your feet. At the far end stands a pavilion open on all sides, its silk canopies fluttering lazily, and under it, a scene from a dream. Lanterns hang from slender poles, shaped like what else? Tulips. The flames flicker, casting tulip-shaped shadows on the white stone floor. Courtiers glide silently in embroidered robes, their colors perfectly coordinated with the surrounding flowers. Saffron golds, deep amethyst, ice blue that catches the candlelight just so, and everywhere tulips, arranged in perfect arcs, floating in shallow dishes, tucked into belts, printed onto the silks. You've stumbled into a tulip festival, and it's not for the masses. This is a private court for invitation only, velvetrope diplomacy. The Sultan isn't here yet, but the mood says he will be. Guests murmur in Turkish, Persian, Arabic, and the occasional French. Every conversation is carefully low, designed not to rise above the rustle of petals or the clink of glass. One servant kneels to refill a sugar bowl carved in the shape of you, guessed it a tulip, and a court poet, perched slightly aloof on a brocade cushion, composes verses with a reed pen, frowning deeply at his half-finished metaphor about love and root rot. Now, you may be asking, was this all just a really fancy garden party? Not quite. Because in the Ottoman world, even leisure was calculated. These festivals, especially in the early 18th century, were part performance, part surveillance. Tulips weren't just on display. You were Dot, who was seated closest to the sultans. Cushion, whose tulips bloomed earliest. Who quoted Rumi with just the right tone of bored elegance. Historians still debate whether these events were deliberately political or just naturally evolved into subtle arenas of power. But regardless, they were efficient. No council meetings, no loud declarations, just a look, a gift, a tulip, and if someone failed to show up, that absence was noted. Quietly, precisely. Ottoman politics didn't often scream. It sighed. You wander now toward a shallow reflecting pool, where guests have begun placing floating candles between bobbing tulip heads. It's mesmerizing. The flames drift slowly, trailing reflections, like silver silk, and then a flute begins to play, the neighborly mournful, eternal, a sound that feels both sacred and tired. It curls through the pavilion like incense. Even the courtiers pause. This is no party anthem. This is memory set to music, and through the soft shimmer of notes, you catch snatches of poetry. The tulip knows no greed, only the joy of returning to dust. Its bloom, like power, must never linger. Someone hands you a small cup delicate, porcelain shaped like an opening bud. Inside, sweet sherbet, rose, lemon, something slightly bitter. It melts on your tongue like snow with opinions. And while this all feels delicate ephemeral, even don't be fooled, this is empire. Packaged in petals and politeness, Sultan Ahmed III, though not present, is everywhere. His taste, his rules, his vision of a society that blooms, but briefly. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. At the height of tulip obsession, certain elite families paid professional flower timers, yes, literal humans, to track the bloom cycles of specific beds. These timers were expected to know, to the day, when a prized tulip would open. Why? Because missing that bloom meant missing your social window. No bloom, no poetry. No poetry, no recognition. No recognition, well, obscurity is a kind of death at court. You sip the last of your sherbet as the flute quiets. Above you, the stars press gently against the canopy of night, and the tulips, those silent guests, remain perfectly still, poised, patient, imperial, just like the empire that adores them. You wander away from the lantern-draped pavilion, still tasting that faint citrus bitterness from the sherbet, and follow a side path shaded by tall cypress trees. The court music grows distant, replaced by something softer still, the chirp of night insects, and the occasional sleepy coo of a dove, nesting in the garden walls. It feels more private here, less performed, but still meticulously arranged. You pass another bed of tulips, this one striking in its uniformity. Dozens of slender fire-tipped petals, rising from identical stalks, all spaced with absurd precision. You could measure it with a string, and as you take it in, it begins to click. This isn't just decoration, this is design with intent. The Ottoman garden, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries, wasn't just a place to grow pretty things. It was philosophy. It was diplomacy. It was control with a floral scent. You glance around, and suddenly you're aware of something strange. You can't actually see into the rest of the garden. Every turn reveals a new room, perfectly walled with hedges, or trees, or low lattice. No wide open views. No chaotic sprawl. Just perfectly measured sections, each with its own balance of water, greenery, shade, and flowers. Ottoman garden. Design, inspired by Persian models, but taken to new heights. Was all about structured nature creating harmony through limits. Sound familiar? It should. Because this mirrored how the Ottomans governed. Just like each province was managed by a bey, under the eye of a pasha, and the pasha under the eye of the sultan, each garden plot answered to a higher order. Historians still argue whether these gardens reflected Islamic cosmology, imperial hierarchy, or just really good landscaping tastes, but the effect was the same. Control disguised as serenity. Even the water knew its place. You come upon a shallow channel, running alongside the path. Clear, barely a ripple. But it's not random. Ottoman gardeners planned water flow like city architects. A garden's entire mood could shift depending on whether the stream was fast and chattery, or slow and glass-smooth, like this one. In formal garden gatherings, the sound of water replaced gossip. People watched the current, not each other. A social silence, curated. And as for the tulips, oh, they weren't just plopped into beds and left alone. Each variety was carefully positioned. Some near the fountains, where mist cooled the petals. Others in dry spots, to enhance pigment intensity. Even the angle of sunlight was considered. A tulip's beauty depended on whether it caught the golden hour. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some gardeners reportedly trained tortoises to help maintain tulip beds. Tiny oil lamps were strapped to their backs, and they were released at dusk. Tortoises would lumber slowly through the beds, eating weeds by lamplight. It sounds like a fever dream, but contemporary miniatures depict the scene. And honestly, it's kind of genius. A slow-moving janitor with built-in mood lighting. Iconic, but underneath all this elegance, there was pressure. Not just to grow a nice garden, but to grow the right garden. Tulip owners, especially in the upper court, were expected to maintain elite bulbs, often rare. Varieties imported at enormous cost, or bred over decades. Failure to bloom wasn't just disappointing. It could be humiliating. One record from the late 1600s tells of a nobleman whose entire garden staff was dismissed quietly. Of course, after a prized moonfire, tulip bloomed lopsided. The tulip had one job, and it failed. You sit now on a low stone wall, its surface still warm from the afternoon sun. Behind you, the rustle of hedges hides the rest of the garden, and in front of you, rows and rows of tulips. Their heads turned toward the moonlight like a chorus frozen mid-song, each one standing alone, yet somehow still part of a greater plan. Just like the empire. Just like the people who ruled it, and maybe, just maybe like you're drifting through it now. The further you wander from the grand courtyards and gossip-laced festivals, the quieter the garden becomes. You step through a carved wooden gate, barely shoulder-height, and find yourself in a narrow pathway hemmed by dense shrubs and citrus trees. Here, the tulips are fewer, but more mysterious. Twisting petals. Faded colors. Some with freckled leaves. This part of the garden feels older, less curated, almost secret. And that's when it strikes you. Tulips weren't just admired. They were red dot in the Ottoman Empire. Flowers spoke. Their shapes, their colors, their arrangements, each element could carry a message. A compliment. A rebuke. A secret, and nowhere was this more refined than in a tradition called the language of flowers, or, as the Ottomans called it, Selam. Now, salam didn't belong to tulips alone. It involved a whole floral vocabulary. A rose might say, "I love you." A marigold might whisper grief. A cluster of basil might politely suggest, "Your manners are appalling." But tulips became the master class, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries. Tulips were used as living metaphors in love poetry, imperial flattery, even mild threats. A red tulip might say, "My heart burns for you." A black tulip, "You're dangerous, and I like it." A broken tulip, those with streaked petals from viral mutation, could represent sorrow, pride, or forbidden beauty, depending on the context. You crouch beside one now. Its petals are striped gold and plum, like the night sky torn open. It leans slightly to one side, unruly, imperfect, and deeply poetic. In fact, many tulips that modern growers would reject as flawed were prized by Ottoman aesthetes. These broken tulips, often infected by a tulip-breaking virus, were adored for their unpredictability. Why? Because a tulip that broke the rules was rare, fleeting, unrepeatable. Historians still debate whether this love for the broken bloom was rooted in mystic Sufi ideas about imperfection and divine longing, or whether the Ottomans just had a thing for the drama. Probably both. And speaking of drama, here's your fringe tidbit. During a certain period, tulip letters, actual paper notes, written in florally coded language, were exchanged between lovers and courtiers. One preserved letter, now housed in Istanbul, reads something like, "If your gaze turns my way, the red tulip will not wither." Translation: Notice me, senpai. This floral flirtation wasn't limited to the elite. Even among commoners, gifting a tulip bulb could signal affection or admiration, but just like today, context mattered. Give someone a pale white tulip with no leaf. You're basically saying you are forgettable. Brutal. And of course, if you really wanted to send a pointed message, you didn't deliver a flower at all, you delivered the absence of one. Imagine receiving a bowl of rosewater with no rose, or a silver tray with space for a tulip left empty, a ghost flower, a message of neglect. You can almost picture it. A noblewoman receives a carved box. She opens it slowly, expecting a rare bulb, but inside only soil. No flower, no bloom, just the silent insult of potential unfulfilled you. Walk on now, through a section of the garden edged with low, scalloped walls. The tulips here lean lazily, as if they know they're not the stars of the show. But you appreciate them all the more, because once you learn the language, you can't unhear it. Every tilt of a stem becomes a whisper. Every curled petal a phrase left unfinished. And isn't that what power often looks like? Not noise, not shouts, but tiny gestures. Small arrangements. You reach a quiet bench beside a dried-up fountain. Its basin is cracked, but there are tulips growing from its edges. One blood red, one golden yellow, one pale and shivering white. They don't seem to care that the water is gone. They speak anyway, and you, dear traveler of empires and petals, are finally starting to understand the accent. The stars above you now are clearer, sharper, scattered like diamonds spilled across deep velvet. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of the city beyond the palace walls continues, a low murmur of night markets closing, of watermen calling, of sandals over cobblestone. But here, in the garden's heart, time has slowed to a floral sigh. And in this quiet, you come across something peculiar. A low wooden box, tucked in the corner of a colonnade, covered with a linen cloth. It's unguarded, forgotten, perhaps. But something inside rustles. You lift the cloth and there, nestled in sawdust and straw, are tulip bulbs. Dozens of them, fat, pale, mottled, like sleeping secrets. And now you see, these aren't decorative. These are currency, contraband, treasure. Because what tulips meant in the Ottoman Empire was only half the story. The other half, they were fought over, smuggled, stolen. Yes, stolen. long before the famous Dutch tulip mania. The Ottoman elite were already deep into their own version of botanical madness. Starting in the 1500s and peaking hard in the early 1700s, tulip bulbs became a form of luxury investment. Rare varieties, particularly those with delicate streaks or strange petal curves, could sell for prices that rivaled gold, horses, even land. Some sultans kept personal tulip ledgers, tracking who owned what bulbs and which varieties bloomed best in which gardens, and if a vizier imported a new breed. People noticed an entire class of bulb couriers emerged, men whose job was to transport these precious roots from Anatolia or Persia to the palace gates. Their carts often disguised the bulbs under heaps of vegetables, tulips masquerading as turnips. Historians still argue whether this level of obsession created its own form of black market, but the circumstantial evidence is strong. There are Ottoman edicts from the early 18th century banning the unauthorized export of tulip bulbs. You heard that right. Tulip smuggling was a real concern in one recorded incident. A gardener in Edon was caught trying to ship rare ashes of wine tulips to a French ambassador under the label kitchen onions. The result: the entire garden staff was dismissed and fined, and the ambassador, he never got his tulips. But it wasn't just foreigners trying to get in on the bloom-based action. Even within the empire, rival elites engaged in a subtle, petty war of petals. Imagine two governors. One brags that his tulips bloomed 6 days earlier than the palaces. The other responds by commissioning an engraved vase showing a decaying tulipa, passive-aggressive, warning that all things, including favor, eventually fade. You can't make this stuff up. And here's your quirky tidbit. There was an actual guild of tulip cultivators in Istanbul. These men had ranks, apprenticeships, and sacred trade secrets. They named their favorite varieties, things like the drunkards, smile diamond on fire, whisper of the saffron breeze, their breeding methods, passed down orally, their soil mixtures, guarded like treasure maps, and the highest ranking among them, known as lolly, ustask, or tulip master, was treated with nearly the same reverence as a religious figure. You pass one such garden now, nestled behind a low wall, painted with faint floral patterns. Through an iron gate, you can just make out neat rows of tulip beds and a lone figure sitting cross-legged on a low cushion, notebook in lap, staring at the bulbs like they might confess state secrets. It's easy to laugh at this level of obsession, but then again, haven't humans always turned beauty into madness? In this world, tulips weren't just status symbols, they were narratives. A way to say, I am refined, I am powerful, I understand ephemerality better than you. And beneath it all, an unspoken truth. Owning something beautiful and brief gives you power over time. But it's risky too. Because what happens when the bloom fades? What happens when your prized variety fails to appear? You stand quietly now, staring down at those sleeping bulbs in the straw. So small, so dull-looking. And yet they held the power to shift friendships, fuel envy, and build or break reputations. You cover the box again. The bulbs rustle softly, like they're laughing at you. Or maybe just dreaming of spring. You move past the shadowy colonnade, the box of bulbs still on your mind. The path now winds toward a quieter wing of the palace complex, one that feels half forgotten. And here, as you duck beneath a vine-covered trellis, you come upon something unexpected. A school. Or at least, what's left of one. Wooden benches tucked under porticos, a slate board leaning against a fig tree, and rows of tulips blooming just behind it, as if they too were trying to learn something. You've arrived at a Medresan Ottoman religious school, and yes, tulips had a role here too, because beyond the court politics, the wealth, the gifting rituals and bulb drama, Tulips were also a spiritual symbol. In Islamic art, especially under the Ottomans, the tulip lolly held a deeply sacred association. Why? Because the word lolly, in Arabic script, is written with the same letters as a lie, just rearranged. It's a quiet coincidence. Or maybe not a coincidence at all. Two Ottoman mystics, especially Sufis, this made the tulip a divine metaphor. Upright, singular, modest. A reminder of God's oneness. You take a seat on one of the benches. It creaks, but holds. And as you gaze toward the tulip beds just beyond the fig tree, the symbolism begins to unfold. A single tulip, rising alone among green leaves, was often used as a stand-in for spiritual discipline. No flamboyance, no showy petals, like a rose. No cloying scent, like jasmine. Just presence, uncomplicated, sincere. Many Sufi poets, particularly those writing in Ottoman Turkish, used tulips in their verses to express divine longing. A lover waits for the tulip to bloom. The tulip blooms only briefly. The lover must let go. See, that's not just gardening, that's theology in petals. Historians still debate whether the widespread sacred association of tulips developed organically from Sufi metaphors, or whether later theologians retrofitted the symbolism after the tulip became politically popular. But either way, it stuck. So much so that tulip motifs were woven into mosque textiles, painted onto Quran covers, and carved into gravestones. And yes, tulip carvings in Ottoman cemeteries were surprisingly common. One tombstone might bear a tulip, leaning to the right. Petals closed, symbolizing a life ended in devotion. Another might have a tulip paired with a feather, denoting a calligrapher laid to rest. These weren't just decorations, they were silent testimonies. Petals where there would otherwise be prayers. You notice a small plaque on the school wall. Faded now. But you can just make out a verse. He who tends the tulip in his soul need not fear the gardener's blade. And now for your quirky tidbit. Some Ottoman calligraphers, trained specifically in tulip scripture style of decorative Arabic writing shaped like blooming flowers. Yes, actual letters, arranged to form a tulip silhouette. These weren't everyday documents. They were often made as royal gifts, or meditative art, or as quiet devotions tucked into private study books, and creating one wasn't easy. Imagine trying to write a verse from the Quran, where each curve also mimics the arc of a petal, balanced, reverent, and graphically beautiful. That's not just art, that's devotion with geometry. You get up from the bench and move slowly toward the tulip bed behind the fig tree. These tulips are different. No showstoppers here. Just soft purples, gentle creams, muted reds, and they bloom in neat little rows, without labels or pomp. You reach down and brush a fingertip along one petal. It's cool, velvety, almost bashful. And for a moment, you forget about all the palace intrigue. The bulb smuggling, the coded insults in bouquets. This tulip says nothing. And that silence. It's the most profound part of the whole empire. Because empires may rise with armies and flourish through architecture, but they often endure because of ideas. And in the Ottoman world, the tulip wasn't just a fashion, it was a reflection of beauty, of brevity, of belief. You stand in the shade of the fig tree as the moonlight brushes the tulips, and now the garden doesn't feel imperial anymore. It feels like a prayer. The fig tree fades behind you as you slip back into a broader path. The hedges thicken, rising above your shoulders like gentle walls, guiding you forward without hurry. Lanterns are fewer here, and your footsteps soften over moss-covered stones. You've wandered into the back gardens, less ceremonial, more personal, and suddenly, you notice, the tulips here are not perfect. They lean, they're mismatched in height. One has a bent stem, another's petals have tiny tears, like it got caught in a windstorm, but the air here is sweet, less perfumed, more earthy. This is not where the guests stroll. This is where the gardeners breathe. And with that realization, you enter the world of the Ottoman gardeners, the quiet force behind the empire's obsession. You don't know their names. Most people didn't, but they were masters of a science that straddled botany, weather forecasting, chemistry, and poetry. To grow tulips in the empire, particularly the rarest kinds, was not a simple matter of planting and watering. No, it was a dance with the earth. And the timing had to be perfect. From the moment a bulb was planted in late autumn, the gardener had to calculate dozens of variables: soil temperature, drainage ratios, moon cycles, local insects, last year's bloom memories. Some gardeners swore that the memory of the previous year's weather could influence the bulb's behavior. Was that science? Was it superstition? Historians still debate that one, but the gardeners believed it. And that belief created rituals each morning. The royal gardeners, called bokovan, would inspect their beds like generals reviewing troops. One crack in the soil, it might mean root rot. One bead of dew on the wrong leaf, it could signal fungus. They used tools passed down through generations: wooden trowels, stained from decades of compost, curved knives honed on old bricks, and watering cans with nozzles shaped like tulip heads for gentle pouring. There's even a miniature painting from the 17th century that shows a gardener bowing to a single tulip as he waters it. Yes, bowing. Whether it was exaggerated artistry or genuine ritual, who can say? But the image speaks volumes about the reverence they held. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some gardeners were known to whisper poems to their bulbs, not to people. To the bulbs. Short verses about spring, or rain, or longing. One account from a palace journal tells of a gardener dismissed after being overheard reciting a love poem, not to the tulip, but to another gardener's tulip. Apparently, it was considered a kind of horticultural trespass. Yes, tulip drama, even among the shovel wielders. But make no mistake, these gardeners were not amateurs. They often kept secret notebooks with hand-drawn diagrams and coded shorthand for their growing methods. These were jealously guarded and passed down like family treasure. You pass a small, low building with open windows and shelves stacked high with clay pots. Inside, 2 oil lamps flicker. A sleepy cat blinks at you from beneath a bench, its tail curled like a coiled hose. This, you suspect, was the gardener's workshop. You step closer. Peering inside, you see a wooden frame mounted on the far wall with dozens of hanging tags. Each one marked with what looks like tulip names: Pearl Voice, Crimson Shadow, Sleep of Rain. The names read like poetry written for dreams. And they're not just labels. Each one represents a bulb with its own lineage, its own temperament, its own glory and risk. Because here's the thing. No matter how skilled the gardener, the tulip might still refuse to bloom. Might sulk for a season. Might bloom once and never again. And in that unpredictability lay the agony and the magic. Ottoman tulip growing was never just about control. It was about surrendering to something slightly beyond it. Something divine, something moody, something Ottoman. You turn from the workshop and find yourself walking a little slower. The garden feels quieter here, but not asleep. You pass a broken spade, half buried in a patch of weeds. A scrap of muslin tied around a twig. A watering can left just slightly off center. These small imperfections don't ruin the garden. They make it feel alive, and somehow, more than all the palace halls and poetry pavilions. It's this space, this patch of soil, care, and quiet that makes you finally understand. The Ottoman tulip obsession wasn't just a fashion, it was a collaboration between emperors and earth, between gardeners and God, between bloom and breath. As you leave the gardener's workshop behind, your footsteps take on a rhythm. You're no longer just drifting, you're tracing the outline of something, a shape that's beginning to make sense. And then, almost by accident, you step into an open courtyard bathed in moonlight. It's larger than the others, less intimate, more ceremonial, and there at its center, surrounded by a low marble platform, is a fountain shaped like, yes, a tulip. Its basin flows with water so gently you only hear it when you listen with intent. The petals are carved open wide, and from their center, a thin stream trickles upward and falls with a sleepy hiss. You're in the middle of a tulip display courtyard, a place where the empire's most prized blooms were presented like relics. And the timing of your arrival is no accident. Because for the Ottomans, tulips weren't just admired by day, they were worshipped at night. You see, the empire developed an entire culture around nighttime tulip viewing. In the spring, especially during the tulip season, lolly devry members of the elite and sometimes carefully selected commoners would gather in gardens, just like this one after sunset. Lanterns were strung between trees, candles floated in basins, musicians played soft melodies on lutes, flutes, and zithers, The tulips glowed, because here's the secret. Some of the most prized tulip varieties were chosen, not just for their color, but for how they reflected firelight. Pale yellows shimmered like gold. Deep purples vanished into the shadows, and whites. They looked like spirits hovering just above the soil. You move closer to a bed of tulips, now lit by a pair of tall, narrow lanterns. The light doesn't just land on the flowers, it passes through them. Each petal becomes translucent, like stained glass telling a story no one can quite translate. And you suddenly understand why this ritual mattered. It wasn't just about tulips. It was about transformation by day. The empire was logic and power and protocol. But by night, it became dream. Historians still argue whether these nighttime tulip events began as religious ceremonies, aristocratic showmanship, or simply moonlit parties that got out of hand. But whatever their origins, they became central to Ottoman court life in the early 1700s. Sultan Ahmed III, in particular, was famous for hosting vast nighttime festivals in his gardens, events that lasted for hours, featured live poetry, shadow puppetry, and desert platters taller than most children. And yes, tulips were everywhere. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Ottomans even engineered special oil lamps designed to fit inside tulip vases, so the flowers would appear to be glowing from within. Imagine strolling through a garden where every bloom flickers like a tiny star. It wasn't just spectacle. It was serenity made visible. These events also functioned as a kind of imperial diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors, if invited, were expected to dress the part, speak softly, and pretend they weren't completely overwhelmed. There's a French journal entry from the period where one poor envoy tries to describe the tulip party he attended. I feared to breathe, lest a petal fall from grace. You chuckle at the drama. But he wasn't wrong. At these gatherings, stillness was performance. Guests moved slowly, laughed gently, recited verses like they might float away if spoken too loudly, and all the while, the tulips listened. It's no wonder the period became known as the tulip era, not because everything was tulip-themed, but because tulips became the metaphor for everything. Life, luxury, lightness, loss. You step now into the very center of the courtyard, where the ground is warm and dry. Around you, the petals seem to lean in, not toward the sky, but toward you. And for a moment, you don't feel like a visitor. You feel like the audience they were waiting for. The water murmurs. The flame flickers. The tulips shimmer. And in that softness, you realize this wasn't just a garden, it was a stage. And the empire, for all its might, was at heart a performer. You leave the glowing courtyard with the softest reluctance, like exiting a dream halfway through the best part. But the path pulls you onward, and soon you find yourself in a passage, flanked by crumbling brick walls, half hidden by ivy. This part of the garden is older, quieter, and strangely empty. No lanterns here, no musicians, no sherbet-sipping courtiers, quoting Rumi, while casually outdressing each other. Just the sound of wind moving through the reeds, and the occasional creak of old wood shifting in the cool night. You've stumbled into the aftermath, because no obsession, no matter how gentle, lasts forever. This is where the story shifts. Not away from tulips, but toward their fall from favor. Yes, the tulip craze had a spectacular rise. But it also had a collapse, and not the gentle sort. During the early 1700s, especially under Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier, Nevaverhurli, Damat Ibrahim Pasha, the empire's tulip fixation reached such opulence that people began to talk lavish festivals, outlandish floral displays, tulip-themed robes, cushions, ceramic tiles. Even rumor has it scented ink made from crushed tulip petals, and while the court bathed in blossoms, parts of the empire, especially rural Anatolia, were struggling. Historians still argue whether this disconnect between the elite's flowery fantasies and the everyday struggles of the people was as extreme as later writers claimed. But one thing is clear: resentment was blooming, and eventually it exploded. In 1730, a rebellion broke out. Not in the gardens, but in the streets. Led by a former janissary turned candlemaker, yes, a man named Petrona Halitha, revolt began in Istanbul and quickly took aim at everything the tulip era had come to symbolize: luxury, excess, disconnect. They stormed palaces, toppled elites, demanded the removal of Sultan Ahmed III himself. And they got it. Ahmed abdicated. His beloved vizier was executed. The court gardens were ransacked. And with them, countless rare tulip varieties were lost forever. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's historical fact. Some of the most prized, bizarre, and lovingly cultivated tulip breeds vanished in a matter of days, torn up, trampled, or burned. The tulip, once a symbol of divine beauty and imperial elegance, was now associated with decadence, weakness, corruption. You pause beside a raised bed, choked with weeds. The soil looks dry. The borders are cracked. No tulips here. Not anymore. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the years immediately following the 1730 rebellion, tulips became taboo in official court art. They didn't vanish entirely, but they slipped quietly into the background. No longer centerpieces, no longer celebrated. One palace inventory even lists floral wall hangings, sans tulip, as if even the mention of them might stir unrest. And yet, they didn't disappear from the hearts of the people. In private homes, tulip motifs continued. On textiles, in shadow puppet plays, in whispered poetry. Because while empires may try to erase a symbol, memory has roots. You sit down on the edge of a dry fountain. Its basin is cracked and filled with leaves, but along the base you spot it faint, almost erased, a tulip carving. The stem is worn, the petals chipped, but it's still there, still standing. The empire moved on, of course. New rulers came, new fashions, new flowers. But none held quite the same place. None bloomed with such layered meaning, and the tulip era, it became legend. Historians today still debate whether the rebellion truly ended the age of tulips, or if it merely shifted the obsession underground. But one thing's certain, the fall was as dramatic as the bloom, because tulips, in the Ottoman story, were never just flowers, they were mirrors, and sometimes, when a mirror reflects too much truth, people break it. You rise slowly. The night is darker now. Still, Somehow, you feel closer to the truth. Not the glowing petals, but the silence that follows. Because the story of the tulip isn't just beauty, it's fragility, and that lingers longer than any bloom. The garden narrows again, the path becoming a thin ribbon of gravel, flanked by rose bushes trying, and mostly failing, to outshine the ghosts of tulips past. A breeze stirs the leaves overhead, and somewhere far off, a night bird lets out a sleepy note that sounds oddly like a sigh. You're heading toward what was once the imperial nursery, though now it feels more like a museum with no plaques. Here, the Ottomans kept their experimental tulip beds, not for show, not for poetry, but for purpose. Because beyond the admiration, the obsession, and even the downfall, there was still curiosity. And this part of the story. This is where tulips meet science. You stop beside a rectangular plot bordered in faded red tiles. Once, this bed was filled with carefully labeled rows of bulbs, each meticulously documented. Now, only a few cling to life, scrappy survivors. From forgotten experiments. What kind of experiments? Well, the Ottomans were surprisingly advanced in horticultural practice. They grafted, they created controlled environments with shaded fabric and hand-cranked irrigation. Some texts from the period describe gardeners documenting bloom cycles down to the hour. One particularly curious account, from an 18th-century palace gardener, includes a chart hand-drawn tracking how tulips reacted to music played on a ney flute. Now, was this botany or early Spotify testing? Historians still argue over the purpose, but it's clear that Ottomans treated tulips as more than decorative. They were test subjects. A way to explore the boundaries of nature, beauty, and control. And that meant cataloging. So many notebooks, some of these logs still survive in museum archives, rows and rows of line drawings with names like Moons, Second Smile, Candle Before Rain, Sulking Daughter. Yes, they were poetic. But they also included notes like, prone to wilt under early frost. Responds to fish compost. Blooms violently, then nothing. You pause at a cracked stone bench, just outside a collapsed pergola, where tangled vines have overtaken everything. This was likely once a shaded lab of sorts, a garden under a garden, where the most delicate bulbs were coaxed and cajoled into something rare. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some Ottoman horticulturists used early forms of bulb refrigeration, sealed clay jars beneath ice-packed cellars to simulate winter and shock bulbs into blooming. Primitive, but effective. An incredibly delicate work, especially when you remember they were doing this centuries before thermostats or even modern glass greenhouses. These efforts weren't just academic either. A new tulip variety could be a political tool, a gift to impress a rival court, a legacy for a fading sultan. There's one recorded incident where a gardener successfully cultivated a triple-colored tulip, red at the base, yellow at the tip, and streaked with black in the middle. When presented to the Grand Vizier, the gardener was gifted a sash of silver thread and a small plot of land. The tulip itself, it never bloomed again. Historians still debate whether the story is true or romanticized propaganda for a sultan trying to seem like a man of culture. But regardless, the idea remains. Tulips weren't just planted, they were pursued. And for some, that pursuit was a lifetime's work. You walk now toward the back wall of the nursery, where a stone basin overflows with brackish water and algae. Floating in its surface one yellow tulip, its stems snapped. Whether by wind, time, or clumsy feet, you'll never know, but it floats perfectly. Upright, defiant. And you realize that's the true spirit of this garden, not the perfect bloom, but the insistence to keep blooming, even after the era ended, because, while the empire eventually faded, and the tulip lost its spotlight, something deeper took root, an understanding that beauty and science, poetry, and patience. Devotion and dirtle belonged together. The Ottomans weren't simply they were tulip engineers, tulip priests, tulip historians, and even now, centuries later, the echoes of their trials live on in every corner of this fading garden. You brush your hand over a flowerbed's lip, and dust coats your fingers. You let it fall. Maybe that's what tulip cultivation was all along, trying to hold something beautiful, knowing it would slip through anyway, but holding it anyway. You press forward, deeper into the heart of the garden complex. The atmosphere has shifted, again less scientific, more secretive. The air is thicker here, richer with damp earth, and something else. Incense. No, something floral, woody, and sweet, like dried petals and dust. And that makes sense. Because now you're entering a space very few outsiders ever saw. The private tulip chambers of the palace women. Yes, if you thought tulip obsession was confined to the sultans, viziers, and poets, you'd be missing half the garden. Welcome to the harem tulip salons, and don't worry, this isn't the scandalized fantasy that Western travelers so often exaggerated. No silk-draped bath scenes, or fountains bubbling with sherbet. The real harem was far more structured, political, and believe it or not, botanical. Because for many palace women, tulip culture became a form of expression, resistance, and identity. The harem was home to hundreds of women, wives, concubines, attendants, tutors, and staff. They came from all across the empire: Persia, the Balkans, North Africa, the Caucasus. Some spoke 6 languages. Others had never seen a tulip before they arrived, and yet, over time, many of them became deeply involved in tulip cultivation. How? They were given private garden plots, small, enclosed spaces within the harem's inner courtyards. These gardens became laboratories of creativity, care, and symbolism. Imagine a young woman from Crimea tending to a bulb her tutor swore would bloom blue, whispering to it in her native tongue, hoping it would make her memorable to the sultan. Or a seasoned matron experimenting with soil from different provinces, trying to coax a dormant variety back to life because it reminded her of her mother's garden. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some women in the harem wrote tulip diaries, little hand-bound books filled with sketches, petal pressings, bloom dates, and musings. One such diary, found centuries later, behind a loose tile, contained a single phrase, repeated over and over between drawings: to bloom is to be remembered. Historians still debate whether this gardening tradition began organically among harem women or was introduced by palace tutors as a quiet pastime. But either way, the gardens became something more than a hobby. They became political currency. In a world where visibility was limited, where your influence depended on your proximity to power, a rare or early blooming tulip could draw attention, praise, favor. Imagine being summoned by the valid sultan not because of your charm or wit but because your tulip had bloomed in an unprecedented shade of violet. That wasn't just gardening. That was strategy, and tulip gifts, carefully potted, wrapped in silk, delivered with coded compliments, became a form of communication within the harem's delicate hierarchy. A gift to an ally might signal friendship. A slightly wilted tulip. To a rival, a subtle insult. A reminder that beauty fades. It wasn't just petals and soil. It was survival. You pause now beside one such courtyard. The walls are high and vine. Within, you glimpse broken planters and faded mosaic paths. In one corner, a marble bench shaped like a crescent moon still stands. Its surface worn smooth by centuries of contemplation. You sit. The wind sighs across the walls, lifting the ghost scent of lavender and thyme, and for a moment, you feel the presence of those long-forgotten gardeners, women whose names were never written in history books, but who lived entire inner worlds through these flowers. This was their power, not shouted, not marched, grown, in secret, in silence. In beauty, it's easy to overlook them. History often does. But these women understood the tulip's true lesson, that influence doesn't always bloom in public. Sometimes, it blooms in private, in patience, in shadow, and in full color. The harem walls fall away behind you, replaced by open sky and a wide gravel path, edged with pines. You're walking downhill now, and the pace feels easier, your feet crunching lightly, your breath sinking to the steady rhythm of this gentle descent. You've entered what was once the public tulip promenade along Avenue where, during the height of the tulip era, common citizens could catch a glimpse of the blooms they'd only heard about in court poems or seen on ceramic tiles. Yes. Believe it or not, tulips weren't always locked behind gates. Sometimes, they were shared. Especially during the annual tulip festivals, which blossomed in Istanbul's outer districts. These were not stuffy court affairs. These were civic celebrations. Lively, noisy, full of music, food, laughter and, of course, tulips everywhere you looked. You stroll past what remains of one of these open spaces. The flower beds are overgrown now, filled with wild grasses and a few stubborn snapdragons trying to hold court. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echoes. Children squealing as they chase each other with flower garlands. Vendors calling out their latest tulip-shaped sweets, marzipan petals, candied stems, sugar-dusted tulip bulbs, yes. Some were edible, at least in theory. Musicians playing meta marches on oversized drums while kite strings tangle overhead like festive spiderwebs. It was color, and movement, and joy. And for many Ottoman citizens, it was their only direct encounter with the empire's prized flower. You pass a faded mural along a crumbling wall. It's chipped in places, but you make out the scene. People of every background gathered in rows, merchants, sailors, bakers, schoolchildren, all gazing at tulips that seem just a little too tall, a little too magical, and perhaps they were, because, for the people, tulips represented something just out of reach. Not just beauty, but aspiration. The dream that elegance, grace, and wonder weren't just for palaces. They could bloom here too, and here's your quirky tidbit. In some Istanbul neighborhoods, local contests were held to see who could grow the strangest tulip. Not the prettiest, the strangest. Winners received small prizes, a silver spoon, a bolt of fabric, a live chicken, but more importantly, they earned respect. The kind of respect that says that man convinced a flower to do something it had no business doing. It wasn't just horticulture, it was magic. Historians still debate whether the empire officially encouraged these public festivals, or merely tolerated them. Some argue they were meant to distract citizens from political unrest. Others believe they were genuine attempts at unity, moments when the empire allowed its walls to breathe a little. Regardless, they left a mark. Poems were written, plates were painted, stories were passed down. Even today, in certain parts of Istanbul, you'll find old men who claim their great-grandmother once grew a tulip so vivid it made a pasha weep. Whether or not it's true doesn't matter. The story has roots. You round a bend and come upon a stone platform. Empty now, but once a stage for tulip performances. You heard that right. There were puppet plays featuring tulip characters. Little shadow figures, with petals for hats, squabbling over rain and sun. Falling in and out of love, in elaborate garden dramas, narrated by hoarse-voiced street performers. It was ridiculous, and tender, and unforgettable. Because for all the palace grandeur and scientific journals, sometimes the tulip's greatest role was as a friend to the people. It could be painted on a water jug, embroidered onto a baby's blanket, drawn by a child in the dust on a doorstep, not just a royal symbol, but a shared one. You sit down on the edge of the platform and glance around. The wind has died. The stars are clearer now, and you realize, even in its decline, the Ottoman tulip continued to bloom just, not always where the empire expected. Not in gold vases, not beneath silk canopies, but in pockets of soil behind bakeries, in cracks between cobblestones, in the heart of a widow's garden, because beauty, once shared, doesn't need a throne, it just needs sunlight. The night has grown long, and the garden quiets with you. Your steps are softer now, almost ceremonial. You've come to the edge of the complexer gentle hill, overlooking the city beyond, where rooftops and domes stretch like a quilt of shadows. Under the moon here, perched on this rise, is the last stop on your journey, the Tulip Archive Pavilion. It's smaller than the grand halls, more humble than the harem gardens, but no less sacred. Once, this space held the official tulip records of the empire. Scrolls, ledgers, dried specimens, and books, so many books. They called it the Lolly Deftery, the Tulip Register, and yes, it was real. Ottoman scribes and botanists maintained detailed tulip inventories, some so precise they recorded not only the color and bloom time, but how a particular tulip behaved on cloudy days. You pass through an arched doorway into a room lined with cedar shelves. Dust clings to the air. Somewhere inside, paper dreams sleep under centuries of silence, and sitting in the center, atop a cushion, faded to ghost rose pink, is a single, lidded box. Wooden, carved with vines, and of course tulips. You reach out and open it, slowly, reverently, inside. A folded parchment. You unfurl it. Handwritten in delicate ink, curved like petals, are the opening lines of a scribe's note. The tulip is not to be owned, only remembered. That's it. No name, no date. Just that, and yet it speaks volumes. Because by now, you've learned this obsession with tulips wasn't really about flowers, it was about meaning, about expressing what the empire couldn't always say out loud. That beauty is brief. That love is uncertain. That power, like petals, can fall in the wind. You lean back against a column and look up. The sky is soft now, turning the color of silk ash. The call to prayer is still hours away, but the silence is so complete, it feels like its own kind of hymn. Let's take a moment here. As the journey settles, this is the tulip's final gift. Stillness. You've traveled through time and empire, soil and soul, lantern light and rebellion. You've met gardeners who whispered to bulbs, scribes who sketched petals like scripture, women who plotted history in planters, and courtiers who fell with their flowers. You've seen tulips rise not only from the dirt, but from intention, from the spaces between lines, from the long pauses in palace poetry. And you've learned that even when they were trampled, outlawed, or forgotten, tulips bloomed again, in private, in secret, in memory. Because the Ottomans understood something the modern world often forgets, that a flower, once loved, never really disappears. And now, as you sit in this pavilion, among the echoes of parchment and perfume, that understanding blooms inside you, to let it root, let it rest, let it carry you gently into the night. And now, we soften. Let the air grow heavier around you, like warm linen draped across your shoulders. Let your breath slow, like the fading flicker of an old oil lamp in a stone corridor. You've walked a long way tonight. Across empires, through gardens cultivated by hands now dust. Over pages turned so many times, their edges curled like petals. And though your feet never left the room, your heart has wandered far. From marble courtyards to harem balconies, from trembling bulbs to glowing lanterns, from the sweetness of poetry to the quiet heartbreak of history, let those images fade. Now let the tulip close, its petals soft, its message heard, its moment complete. In this quiet garden of thought, there is no need for answers, only presence. Let your breath match the rhythm of the night wind. Let your thoughts pass by, like shadows on a pond. Let your eyes grow heavier with each passing silence, because beauty, like sleep, does not arrive by force, it arrives by invitation. So give in, let go. You've done enough for today, and as you drift gently Yosellian to rest, know this, the tulips will still be here tomorrow, and so will I. Sweet dreams.